Welcome back to the round table. Joining me right now, I have Tabitha Madheka, who has been a widow for 18 years, and also Margaret, who is a psychologist, and she'll be sharing with us some tools that can help anyone who perhaps is dealing with loss on how they can cope and get past this very, very traumatizing life experience. So let me start with you, Tabitha, because you've been a widow for 18 years.
Yes.
And you got married at 23.
Yes.
So at the time your husband was passing on, how many kids did you have then?
I had 2 children. I had just gotten my son.
You just gotten your son.
He was 2 days old.
And I can imagine that must have been very traumatic.
It was very devastating.
Because on one hand you're losing a husband, spouse, on the other hand you've just gotten a newborn. So you don't know whether to be happy, you don't know whether to be sad.
Yes.
And how were you able to deal with that?
It was very devastating. It was a very difficult time because I had just gotten my son, and then I got the news that my husband, the following day actually, he had passed on. Because we had agreed that he would come to see us in hospital, and he couldn't come because he was also admitted.
So his was sudden illness?
It wasn't sudden, but he wasn't very sick, because the time that he went to hospital, he was just going back for a checkup, a normal checkup, but he was detained. He was told that he could not come, he could not go home, because the doctor diagnosed something different, so from what he was going to be checked on. So he had to be detained. So I got my baby, and then the following day we were released, and apparently he hadn't been released as well. So I had decided that I would go to see him in hospital, but it never happened because now he passed on the following day.
And was it hard for you afterwards?
It was very hard because my husband was one person who was ever there for me. He was a spoiler. He was the person who did everything for me. He would come, pick me, take me to the clinic from work, drop us back and go back to work. So he was the kind of a person that when he went, I was in shock. Yes, I was left like an orphan. Yes.
And who supported you through the grieving process and thereafter? His family, your family?
Now I had, I turned mostly to God. I really soaked myself in God. And throughout that time of grieving, and also my family really supported me, and also my in-laws, they also supported me.
Okay.
That time.
So maybe let me ask you this, Margaret, because we've had the stories of different women, different experiences. So obviously Tabitha is a bit lucky because she had support.
Yes.
But the reality is that most women usually don't.
That's true.
There really are horror stories out there within the society.
Yes.
So what do people need to consider when it comes to losing a spouse, especially when it comes to your mental well-being?
A lot happens when you lose a spouse because you see you're connected in terms of your dreams and aspirations, and of course in building a home together. So everything is shattered. And then mostly when the widows are looking for support, it's not so easy to get it. There are very few people who get support from society. And sometimes there's a blame game, almost like you're responsible for this person's death. If he was unwell, did you take good care of him? Why didn't you alert people? And many times widows are innocent. They need psychological support to be able to go for therapy. They need help from friends and family. And they need to have even a support system, probably in their faith-based institution, if it is church or wherever it is they go to.
So obviously we know that there are stages of widowhood. Like she said, she was shocked, then there's
Yes.
the grief. So ideally, what are some of the tools that anyone who perhaps is going through this loss and grief can employ in their own life? Because nobody can really, plan death. Death is something unexpected. Yeah?
Yes.
And in most circumstances, it catches everyone unawares.
Yes.
So ideally, what would you say to someone who's just learned right now, your spouse is gone?
Grief and loss is inevitable for every human being to experience. And of course, the initial reaction is shock and denial. because your mind cannot fathom that this catastrophe has taken place. How is it possible? And as you go through healthy grief, it is good to confront it, because the moment you avoid it, it ends up causing a lot of trouble in terms of emotions and trauma. So being able to accept is actually the key to the beginning of your healing.
Right. We also have with us in studio Nelson Arthur, who is a psychologist. Now, Nelson, I really want you to add on to this conversation, but really focusing on the men who have lost spouses. Most of my guests were women, and they were able to share how they coped. But I really want you to talk to the men, because sometimes men can have a hard time processing emotions. Nelson?
Yes, thank you. Men have difficulty in processing emotions after the loss of their spouse, their wife. And this is contributed by the society looking at men as people who are strong, as people who are the providers of the needs around the family. And so when the support system that is around them is taken away, it leads them into a rock bottom of emotions, a pool of confusion, because grief is a new space when it happens for everyone. And also for men, it becomes a really difficult place for them to start. And the society really will look down on a man when he starts to cry, while he starts to lean into the grief that they are giving. So in the society, very few men really grieve in the appropriate way. Yeah.
Okay. And I want us to focus now maybe on the children, especially men who are left with kids. How can they especially help their kids cope with the loss of now a parent, and in this case, the mother?
When it comes to men supporting the family in terms of leading the children to process the grief, remember, grief you can only process your grief so that you can really help even your children to process grief. So one of the ways I think men ought to embrace in assisting children to process the grief is first of all sharing and speaking out the challenges that they face while they are engaging in parental duties, and also having an open discussion in terms of grieving as a family, embracing the family grief, talking to children. Where are you in your journey of grief? Where are you in your processing of emotions? What do you feel you miss the most about your mother? What do you think is something that we could do for us to celebrate our mother in a different way? So I think for men, embracing and having the talks, because children really feel grief. You might ignore them, but it is in them. It only can erupt when it has grown over a long time, over a long period of time. And so having open discussion is one of the ways of men assisting children to process grief, and also going for therapy, family therapy, getting a therapist who can take you through the process of grief as a family.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you for that. Now, a lot of what he said also touches on women, Margaret, I'm sure.
Yes.
And now, there's something common across all my guests, even from Frida, Janet, who are in their 70s, Millie, Tabitha, Gladys. And let me ask you, Tabitha.
Yes.
Have you moved on? Is it something that you're considering?
Well, according to the Bible, that is something I'm free.
Okay.
And so, yeah, I wouldn't say I am not.
So you're open to it?
Yes, I am.
If the right one comes along,
Absolutely.
you're willing to start a new chapter?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes.
And she's brave for that, because, a lot of the times, especially for widows, it's very difficult to move on. Why is that?
I think the attachment to the spouse, and also the thought of getting acquainted to someone else, and then the person doesn't fully accept the children, and that causes a disruption in their developmental stages and probably even education. So as wanting to protect the children as a mother, many times they can overlook their own emotional needs just for the sake of the children.
And incidentally, we find that especially in this society, it's easier for men to move on. Why is that also?
It is a patriarchal society in Africa, and it is more acceptable for a man to move on. And they question when a woman moves on pretty fast. In fact, the question is, was she just waiting for him to die so that she can now get married? And we are not kind to women. We are not.
Have you experienced that, Tabitha?
Very much so. I have found it's so hard to even accommodate the questions that you are asked about why haven't you moved on? And others are not up to the idea. You don't have to. You don't need to.
So you're judged either way. If you
Yes.
don't move on, you're judged. If
Yes.
you move on, you're judged.
That is it.
There's really no winning.
Yes.
And in that situation, so what advice would you give anyone who finds themselves now there, where you're like, you know what, if I start dating, I'll be judged. And if maybe I stay by myself also, you know, that comes with its own challenges. There can be loneliness.
That's a catch-22
Yeah.
situation. And I think it's an individual decision. Because as a widow, you need to decide what is best for me. There is no tailor-made or cut-out answer for every person. But as long as you know that you and your children are safe, then that is what you need to consider first and foremost.
Okay, and there's a term that I've come across. It's called widow syndrome.
Yes.
So tell me about that.
Well, the widow syndrome is getting into a position whereby you kind of get into self-pity. And you kind of feel like the world owes you because you're a widow. And you get to a point where you do not even want to improve yourself or to do anything that is beneficial. And you're always watching out to see who's going to criticize you. And I think this can be very limiting. So it's good to be free. Emancipate yourself from people's thoughts and expectations of you. As long as you're not breaking any law, breaking any tradition, or doing anything that is outlandish, just keep within the rules of society and, of course, of God, if you do respect God, which is important. And you can move on with your life.
Okay, and Nelson, finally, maybe speaking to the men, what advice do you give to any man who perhaps wants to move on?
The advice I give to a man who wants to move on first is to question the intention of moving on. There is various intention that lies within the life of a man that might cause them to move on. For instance, family duties. You have young children that both working and taking care of them is a challenge. Then I think if a man looks at the well-being of the children and his well-being to raise a family, with regard to the good things about their spouse or the agreement that maybe was there, then a man could take the decision and allow himself to first process the grief and then allow himself to move on in a very appropriate way. But it includes discussions between various relationships that surround the man so that the decision that he moves into does not destroy the previous relationships that he has built with the previous, with the deceased or the late. So I think for me, when men take that initiative to move on, I think it's a support system to their way of life and also looking at the interest of the children to raise a beautiful family.
Well, okay, thank you so much for that, Nelson. Margaret, Tabitha, thank you so much for coming on the table. That's all the time we have on today's episode. And to you, I really do hope that you've learned something and we've earned the privilege of your time. Until next week, this has been Real Talk Roundtable with Tamima. Do enjoy the rest of your viewing.